Hello everyone. This is going to be a short little lesson on generalizations and instances. In particular, we're going to be interested in the relationship between a generalization and its instances. This will be a very important concept to have before we start to really get into our new predicate derivation inference rules. These rules will include the rule universal elimination, existential introduction, universal introduction, and existential elimination. The next video or videos will address how each of these new predicate derivation inference rules work, but all of them will require a basic understanding of the relationship between generalizations and their instances. I am going to use a little bit of notation that's not from the textbook, but I find this notation to be much more useful, and so you'll see this when we move on to the next videos on those inference rules. So let me just draw a universal quantifier with a variable v and then a formula that contains that variable v. As you know, our variables are actually the letters w, x, y, and z. And then I want to introduce another bit of notation, and that is to be understood as the above formula, the for all v dot 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 v dot dot dot. So this notation here on the second line is going to be the exact same as the generalization, but with a few differences. Number one, the quantifier is not on the second line. You'll notice that the parentheses have also been dropped. And you'll notice that instead of a v, we have an n here. And the n just stands for any name. And you know that in our language, the names are the lowercase letters a through, believe it or not, v, even though I'm using v to stand in for all of our variables up on that top line. So we would call this top line a generalization. And we would call this bottom line an instance. Sometimes an instance is called a substitution instance. And sometimes it's called a uniform substitution. Uniform substitution is a mouthful, so you'll usually hear me just use the term instance. The uniform substitution is the most descriptive term for what we're talking about. And that's because every occurrence of the name of the variable v, whatever the variable is, whatever the variable of quantification is, every occurrence of that variable will have been replaced by a name, the same name. So it's a uniform substitution. All occurrences of the variable have been replaced with the same name. And that's all a substitution instance is, or a uniform substitution instance is. So let's take a look at some very specific examples. So let's imagine this sentence right here. There is an x, L, X, X. So for us, this could mean something like somebody loves themselves. Okay? So That's a generalization. It's an existential generalization. Its only logical operator is the existential quantifier. So let's take a look at some substitution instances, some uniform substitutions. So we can drop the quantifier and replace the variable of quantification x with the name a. And we'll replace all of the x's with the same name a. So here's our generalization, and here's our instance. And it is a uniform substitution because all occurrences of a variable have been replaced with the exact same name. Okay, so let's back up just a bit. And imagine a different instance and see if it works. LBB. So once again, the quantifier has been dropped and the variable x has been replaced uniformly with the name b. And so once again, the sentence on the top is a generalization. It's an existential generalization. And the sentence on the bottom is a substitution instance. It's a uniform substitution. Let's back up a little bit and try this one out. So here we have the existential generalization. There is an x, LXX, and we have this sentence down below, LBA. Maybe this means, Bart loves Albert. We do not have a uniform substitution here. We have a sentence that has some similarities to the existential generalization, but instead of uniformly substituting the same name for the variable x, we're substituting different names for the variable x. This is not an example of a generalization and its instance, okay? Because of that variance. We want to see uniform substitutions. So here's another generalization for all x. Suppose this says if x is a horse, then x has a tail. Once again, the main operator is our universal quantifier. Variable of quantification is x, and we do see two occurrences of the variable x. If we're to form a uniform substitution of this generalization, we would drop that quantifier and with it the outer parentheses, and then we would replace the variable x in all occurrences with the same name, any name we like. We can go with the lowercase g here if we like. That's an individual constant in our language. Okay, and so once again we have a generalization and its instance. Okay, and so that's another example. And this also helps you make sense a little bit of that new notation that I mentioned. I want to use the variable v, the letter v to stand in for any of our variables, and then we're using the lowercase letter n to stand in for any of our names. And what we need to understand is that what this expression means, it's not clear, so you have to listen to my explanation, is that all occurrences of the variable v, whatever that variable happens to be, all occurrences of that variable have been replaced with the same name n. Okay, and we'll look at how the book expresses this syntactic change, dropping quantifiers, replacing variables with names. We'll look at the book's notation when we look in the next videos on the predicate derivation inference rules. One last comment about this. When I talk about when I talk about a generalization and its instances, I'm just talking about a syntactic relationship between the generalization and its instance. You know, if I say there is an x, L, x, b, and then I drop the quantifier in the variable and replace the x with a b, okay, then what we have is a generalization, and we do have an instance, uniform substitution. That's just a description of the syntactic change or the changes in the symbols, dropping the quantifier, replacing the variable with a name. It is not saying that that is a valid inference. So I'm not talking here about what's a legal move or an illegal move. So what I would say is that this sentence, which may say somebody loves Bart, and then this sentence, Bart loves himself, Bart loves Bart, stand in that relation of this is a generalization and this is one of its instances. However, you'll have to make sure that you're applying the rules, the inference rules correctly when it comes to doing derivations. It turns out that our rule for using existential quantifiers would not permit this move. This would actually be an illegal move. According to our inference rule, existential elimination. Okay, it's a bad move, but nevertheless, the top sentence is a generalization and the bottom sentence is an instance. Because again, an instance is simply involves symbol manipulation. We're dropping a quantifier and we're replacing a variable with a name. Okay, so I think that should help us understand the relationship between generalizations and instances. It's really a kind of a simple idea, but is a very important one for interpreting and applying correctly 4 of our new inference rules. And we will see videos on those inference rules coming up very soon.